Hi guys, this is Matthew Turpin. This is my Genius Hour project for EDN-595. I chose to do Panettone for mine, which is called the Mount Everest of bread baking. And I chose to do this because my girlfriend is part Italian and her family has this every year at Christmas. And it's a tradition in Italy, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. But let's get going. So to make panettone, you need a sourdough starter, and I could make a whole presentation on just how to do a sourdough starter, but I tried some recipes and I wasn't having a lot of success, and I was asking for some help online, and I got called out by an Italian, and the person said, "I'm not trying to be rude, but in Italy you get laughed at if you try to make panettone with store-bought yeast." So I went back to the drawing board and created a sourdough starter. And it's apparently bad luck not to name yours. So I named mine Sour Patch Chris. And if you look on the left here, that's just after refreshment. So the starter, you add flour and water back to it and feed it. And then on the right, that's after 4 hours of fermentation. So that's a good rise for my starter. So I got done. I dried a bunch of it and for long-term storage, so I don't have to keep feeding it, and I can just have it dried, and it should last for months or even possibly years before I can just go back and reuse it, and it should get back to having that same strength pretty quickly, and instead of having to take a couple of weeks to create one. So panettone starts with bread flour. You want a high protein flour to make this. And the recipe that I found that I like the best actually calls for an even higher protein content. So I got some vital wheat gluten and added it, and it has like a calculator to help you figure out exactly how much to add. And you want the protein content around 14%. So I figured out what I needed, and that's the vital wheat gluten on the picture on the left here with that little darker brown color on top of the white color. That's the vital wheat gluten that I added to the bread flour. And you add some sugar and water. And this bottom right picture is the first dough before I added any fat to it. So let's talk about fat. So panettone has a lot of sugar and fat in it, which makes it kind of tough to work with, but it makes it taste good, right? So on the left here, you can see a picture of the almond oil-based plant butter. So I'm actually allergic to casein, which is milk protein, so I can't have regular butter, which is sad, but I finally found this stuff. So you can find it in your dairy case, and they have a couple of different kinds of plant butters, but it's amazing. It's one of the best products I've found in a while, and it acts just like regular butter for baking purposes and cooking and things. So I've been really excited to find that. And also, you only use egg yolks for this recipe. Some panettone recipes calls for whole eggs, but as you know, egg yolks that's where all the fat and the good stuff is. So that's all you use for this panettone recipe. So it does make it kind of a challenging dough to work with, but if you follow the process, you should have some success. So this picture on the left is after the addition of the egg yolks, the butter, and the sourdough starter. And this is after about an hour of mixing. So I'll talk a little bit more about gluten development later, but it takes a long time to get this dough where you need it so it can do what it needs to do to get that nice, light, airy sponge. The picture on the right here is I added a little bit of the dough to a jar to kind of help me gauge how high it's risen. So, because the other one was in a bowl and it was kind of hard to tell if it had tripled because you want it to triple overnight. So, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. First, we're going to talk about the aromatics. So, there's dried fruit in panettone, and there's a lot of different versions of panettone. Some of them have just raisins, some of them have chocolate chips, some of them have dried tropical fruits, which we'll talk about that in a little while. But for this is a really traditional recipe. So it's got honey, orange zest, lemon zest, vanilla bean, which is over here on the left, and on the top right we've got golden raisins and brown raisins, and they're actually soaked overnight in cointreau and water. and then candied lemon and orange peel. So that's a really traditional panettone, which is what I wanted to try to make. And you can actually make candied lemon and orange peel yourself. I mean, you could do it. You can make your own raisins if you really wanted to, but I just bought raisins and I just bought candied lemon and orange peel because I was really trying to focus on making the panettone itself. So this picture on the left is my first dough after it rose overnight. And I don't have a proofing box, but a good trick that I learned is if you take your oven and you turn the oven light on, because most oven lights, they still use incandescent light bulbs because that's the best way and it produces heat. So your oven with the light on is a great way to raise bread. It's like the perfect proofing box for doing bread. I don't know why anybody would buy one personally, but it works great. So that's what I used. And this is the first dough after it rose overnight, and that's probably about triple in volume, and it looks really good. That's perfect. So on the right here is there's a lot that went into that picture. It's a simple picture, but a lot went into it. So it's the second dough. So after you take this first dough on the left and you add all the aromatics, you add more flour, more sugar, more water, more butter, and more egg yolks, and then about another 45 minutes of mixing. So it's about 2 hours plus of mixing in my stand mixer to get the final dough that you're going to rise and proof to bake. So that's a lot. So it's a very involved process to make this. And when you get done mixing it, you actually just fold the drained and chopped fruits in. So they're just folded into the dough pretty simply. So let's have a science lesson. Let's talk about gluten. So this dough needs to rise a lot. So to make sure that it has enough strength, it has to pass what's called the window pane test. And that means that you can stretch it thin enough to see light through it without it tearing. And having that high gluten flour that we talked about and taking this extended amount of time that I talked about to develop these gluten strands are the only way to achieve this. So gluten is a protein and it wants to stick to itself, but you have to give it an opportunity to. So the more you mix, the more those glutens, those strands of that protein stick together and they create strength in a dough. For example, that's why when you make pancake batter or scone batter or biscuit batter, you don't want to mix it a lot because you don't want a lot of gluten development because the more gluten development makes it tougher. But for this, you want it to be tough because you're going to rise it overnight and that's going to make it soft. So it's an interesting process, and I learned a lot about dough and baking bread by doing this. So a little neat science lesson. And to have a science lesson, we should also have a math lesson. So to determine how much dough goes into these molds, you have to figure out the volume of the mold. And there's tons of different kinds of molds. In Italy, I mean, there's so many different kinds. I just found some on Amazon. I don't know that you could find this in town anywhere, but the recipe that I use that I like the best has a calculator and helps you calculate exactly how much of that final dough that you make to put in your mold to create the right loaf. So I figured I needed 1,166 grams of flour for the final proofing. So you take that final dough that I made and you do this. You have to shape it. So you shape it and shape it, and then you put it in this paper mold that you can see here. You see the little brown rib thing on the bottom there. That's the paper mold, and then I proof that again in my oven, just like I did the first dough. And if you look at the top here, you can see that I've scored kind of the shape of a cross and then put butter in there. And that's the traditional way to make panettone. There's a lot of different varieties of that. I've seen pearled sugar being put on top, slivered almonds. There's a couple of different ways to do the top, but the score with the butter in there is the traditional way. So that's that on that picture on the left there. That's ready to go in the oven to be baked. Okay, so when you get done baking panettone, you have to hang it upside down. And the reason you have to do that is because it's so delicate and the fats aren't set up yet that it'll actually collapse on itself if you don't hang it upside down. So you have to, I took a skewer here and I skewered it and I actually hung it inside one of my pots. So I used like a big soup pot and hung and just rested it on top of that so it could hang upside down and let it cool for about 5 hours. And then you can see this picture on the right here of me holding it. That's after I slice. So that's called a crumb shot. So you can see how much it's risen after it bakes. So one more little side note. Panettone is traditionally eaten at Christmas time, which we talked about, but it's also eaten now in Brazil from Italian immigrants going to Brazil, which I thought was pretty interesting. And they've kind of made it their own thing. So now you have this tradition in Brazil as well, and they add like dried mango and stuff like that. So instead of the raisins that I use and lemon peel, they might have dried papaya or dried mango or these tropical fruits in it. And I thought that was really interesting for a history teacher. So let's talk a little bit about sources. This recipe at the top, this breadtopia recipe, that's the best one I found. And I tried 3 other recipes and I read at least 10 or 15 different recipes. But that's the one that works the best. It's got the most detail. It talks about the science behind why you're doing things. It talks about the reasons. It has calculators to help you figure out ratios and how much you need of this, that, and the other. And it's a really good recipe, and I highly suggest it if you want to try this. And the second website there, the Chic Eats recipe, that's how to make that sourdough starter. And that's a really easy to follow recipe. There's a really complicated ones online, but that one's pretty simple, and it really worked well for me. So I like to suggest that one. And then I said I dried a bunch of my starter to hopefully store it long term. And this next source here, the Perfect Loaf, that kind of gives you some tips on how to dry it and how to maintain it long term. And then these other 2 sources at the bottom, those are a couple other recipes that I actually tried and didn't work. They just didn't work very well. I was not impressed. I ended up with almost like a fruit cake, and that's not what you're looking for panettone. Panettone is a very delicate, buttery, sweet bread, and it's wonderful to eat. And these just did not turn out to be like that, and I wasn't happy with them. But the one at the top, the Breadtopia, that's the one that I would definitely suggest if you want to make panettone for yourself. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation. I really enjoyed making it. And if you have any questions, I would love to answer them. Thank you.